I'm Samantha Foster, and this is VenusMastermind, a space for honest reflection, pattern breaking, and sovereign thinking. I'm not here to perform or to teach in a formal way. This is a shared reflection, a place to think out loud, to name what's been living in me, and to speak honestly about what I'm seeing and integrating. There's no agenda here beyond truth and presence. If something here resonates, take what's yours and leave the rest. Welcome back to the internal ecosystem. If you've been with me through the first 2 episodes, you already know this series isn't about theory. It's about the architecture underneath how we live, the invisible frameworks most of us are running from or through or with, without ever stopping to really look at them. In the first episode, we looked at morals, not the Sunday school version, not the one your culture handed you and said was universal, but what morals actually are: judgment systems, frameworks that got installed early, often before we had any real language for them. And that shaped identity, shame, belonging, and worth in ways most of us never fully examined. In the second episode, we moved into values. And what I really wanted to land there is that values aren't the ideals on your vision board. They're behavioral priorities. They show up under pressure. They're revealed by what you actually protect when you can't protect everything at once. Not what you say you care about, what your choices already show you care about. So we've been doing internal work, real sometimes, uncomfortable, deeply personal, internal work. And today, that shifts. Because here's something I had to sit with for a long time before I could articulate it. You can do all of this work, get genuinely clear on your judgment systems, align your priorities, feel coherent and grounded inside yourself, and still cause harm to someone else. Still misuse power without even realizing it. Still leave an impact you never intended. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when your internal world makes contact with someone else's. And that's exactly where ethics come in. Ethics isn't primarily about intention. It's about impact. It's what comes online the moment your internal world touches someone else's nervous system, their autonomy, their lived reality. Morals organize meaning. Values organize priority. Ethics govern responsibility, specifically in those moments where your choices influence, constrain, or cost other people. This isn't a reset from what we've covered. It's a natural progression. We're moving from internal clarity into relational accountability, from what makes sense to me to what happens to others because of me. That's the internal ecosystem, and today we're going into ethics. Let me name something I think gets in the way before we begin. The word ethics carries a lot of weight for most people, and not in a comfortable way. The moment it enters a room, something shifts. It stops feeling like a neutral concept and starts feeling like a verdict, like someone is about to be sorted into the good pile or the bad pile, like someone's about to get judged. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because that version of ethics isn't what we're working with here. Ethics isn't a measure of your character or your spiritual advancement. It's not a rank you earn or an identity you carry around to signal your evolution. Those associations get layered on top of it, and they do real damage, because they turn ethics into something that generates shame instead of clarity. What ethics actually is, functionally, is a responsibility system. And responsibility systems only activate when something specific is present. That something is power. Not power in the dramatic sense, not thrones and boardrooms, but in the everyday sense. When your choices affect someone else's options, when someone is vulnerable to your decisions, When you have access or information or influence that someone else doesn't, when what you do or don't do lands in someone else's life, that's where ethics lives, not in your intentions, not in how you see yourself, in relationship, in the space where your internal world reaches into someone else's lived reality. And here's something I've come to understand pretty clearly. Most ethical conversations aren't really about confusion. They're about discomfort. Discomfort with acknowledging impact. Discomfort with the reality of power. Discomfort with responsibility that good intentions alone don't resolve. So that's what we're actually doing today. Not ranking, not blaming, not trying to prove anything about who's a good person and who isn't. Just building the ability to see power clearly and hold responsibility without it collapsing into shame. That's the work. And once we understand what ethics isn't and why that confusion causes so much noise, we can get clear on what it actually is. So let me get specific, because I want to give you a functional definition, not a philosophical one. Ethics are moral principles expressed through responsibility. They govern how you choose to act when your actions affect other people, especially when power, influence, vulnerability, or unequal access to information are present. And here's the simplest way I know to say it. Ethics aren't about who you are. They're about how you act, specifically in those moments where someone else is affected by what you do. They regulate conduct, not character. They're a guide for behavior, not a verdict on identity. At the center of it all, ethics really come down to 3 questions. Simple on the surface, often uncomfortable underneath. What is my responsibility here? What impact do my actions have? And how am I using power in this situation? That's it. Everything in ethics, when you trace it back far enough, leads to those 3 questions. Ethics is the practice of responsibility in the presence of power. And once we have a working definition, the next question becomes, when does ethics actually apply? Because it doesn't apply to everything, and that distinction matters. One thing worth naming early, ethics don't apply to everything. They're not a constant background hum you're supposed to be monitoring at all times. They get triggered. Specific conditions bring them online. Those conditions show up when you're holding power over an outcome, when you have information someone else doesn't have, when someone depends on your decision, when someone is vulnerable to your action or your silence. Anytime your choices create an asymmetry between you and another person, that's when ethics enters the picture. And here's the piece I really want you to sit with. Ethics are triggered by impact, not intention. Intent matters. It matters a lot for understanding yourself and what was driving you. But impact is what activates ethical responsibility. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Holding both is part of what ethical maturity actually looks like. So now that we know when ethics activates, let's spend a moment clearing away what is often confused with, because these misunderstandings do real damage. I want to spend a moment here, because ethics gets misused in some very specific ways, and those misunderstandings have consequences. Ethics isn't a fixed rule set. It's not a compliance checklist. It's not a measure of your spiritual advancement or a tool for correcting other people. It's not the law. It's not popular consensus. And it's not good intentions. Any of those things can exist completely independently of ethics, and often do. What I've seen happen, and I've been on both ends of this, is ethical language being used as a ranking system to prove someone is more evolved, more aware, more conscious. And I want to say this clearly, that is not ethics. That's a power move wearing ethical clothing. Real ethics don't position you above someone else. It just asks what responsibility you hold in this moment, in the relationship, with this impact. Ethics are contextual, situational, and relational. They live in real moments with real consequences, not in abstract principles, not in appearance, and not in performance. Think about someone who calls out a coworker publicly for being unprofessional, but does it in a staff meeting, in front of everyone, in a way that humiliates rather than addresses. They may genuinely believe they're upholding a standard. They might even be right about the behavior, but the way they used that moment, the power of the room, the audience, the spectacle, that's not ethics functioning. That's ethics as performance, as positioning. The cause might be legitimate. The method is something else entirely. All of that clears space for a distinction I really want you to hold, because it shapes everything else in this ecosystem, the difference between ethics and morals. This is a distinction I want to land clearly, because it shapes everything else we're doing here. Morals are judgment systems. They sort and categorize right and wrong, good and bad, worthy and unworthy. That's their function. Ethics isn't doing that work at all. Morals ask, is this a good person? Is this person good? Ethics asks something different. Was responsibility held appropriately where power existed? Those are not the same question, and the distance between them matters more than most people realize. Someone can have deeply held moral beliefs and still have weak ethics, because moral certainty isn't the same thing as relational responsibility. I've seen this. You probably have too. A person can be utterly convinced of their own goodness and still misuse power, minimize impact, or avoid accountability entirely. The conviction doesn't make them accountable. It makes them feel righteous. And ethics will sometimes push back against moral norms, because cultures can moralize harm, exclusion, and imbalance without ever naming it as such. Ethics asks us to look again, more carefully, more honestly, with less judgment and more responsibility. I grew up in a religious household where moral conviction was everything, and that conviction got used to justify a lot of harm. The beliefs were real, the certainty was absolute, but the ethics, how power was being used, what impact it was having on the people who had no choice but to absorb it, those were never part of the conversation. That's the gap I'm talking about. You can be completely convinced you're right and still cause real damage. Moral certainty isn't the same thing as ethical responsibility. Right alongside that, there's another pairing worth separating, because values and ethics get collapsed into each other just as often.
Ethics versus values, a structural difference.
Values and ethics are also often collapsed into each other, and they're not the same thing. Values are priority systems. They answer a deeply personal question: what do I protect when trade-off exists? They tell you what matters to you. They orient your life and guide your decisions. Ethics answers something different and more relational. What responsibility do I hold when my choices affect someone else? Here's the part that sometimes surprises people. Without ethics, values can justify almost anything. A value without ethical constraint can become irrational for harm, especially when power is involved. Values tell you what you care about. Ethics tell you what you owe when others are impacted by that care, by your choices, or by your authority. Both matter. They just do different work. Someone who values loyalty above almost everything, that's a real deeply held value. But loyalty without ethical constraint can mean covering for a friend who's causing harm, Staying silent when speaking up is what responsibility actually requires, or protecting the relationship at the expense of someone who got hurt in it. The value isn't wrong, it's just incomplete on its own. Ethics is what asks, who else is in the picture, and what do I owe them? There's one more set of conflations worth naming, because mixing ethics up with law, authority, and culture creates some of the most persistent confusion I see.
Ethics versus law, authority, culture, and universal law.
Law is a compliance system. It tells you what you're required to do or prohibited from doing within a given jurisdiction. Authority is positional. It grants decision-making power based on role or hierarchy. Culture tells you what's socially acceptable within a particular group. None of these are the same as ethics, and none of them guarantee it. Something can be perfectly legal and still cause harm. Something can be culturally normal and still be a misuse of power. Something can be endorsed by authority and still be wrong. Ethics exist precisely because systems and cultures can normalize harm without ever naming it that way. Ethics name responsibility regardless of what the law permits, what culture accepts, or what authority sanctions. And I want to name one more thing here. The universe doesn't enforce ethics either. There's no cosmic system that rewards ethical behavior or punishes its absence. When we wait for that, when we expect external consequences to do the work of accountability, we quietly give up our own agency. Ethics doesn't live in cosmic consequence. It lives in choice, in the decision to hold responsibility even when no one is forcing you to. Often culturally normalized in corporate environments, but the power asymmetry in that arrangement, a company protecting its interest at the direct expense of someone else's ability to survive, that's worth looking at ethically, regardless of what the contract says. Legal didn't make it responsible, it just made it permitted. Now, with all of that in place, I want to look at what happens when ethics stop working the way it's supposed to. Starting internally, because that's often where it gets twisted first.
Internal misuse of ethics, what it does to the nervous system.
When ethics get misused internally, it stops being a guide and becomes a warden. And I know this one personally. I still catch it sometimes. It shows up as constant self-monitoring, a low-level vigilance that never quite turns off, the compulsion to over-explain every decision, overcorrect every misstep, and sometimes freeze completely when what the moment actually needs is action. Over time, the nervous system absorbs a quiet and very convincing message. Power is dangerous. Impact is dangerous. The safest thing to do is shrink. And shrinking feels responsible. It can even feel noble, like you're being conscientious, careful, evolved. But it isn't ethics. It's hypervigilance wearing ethical clothing, and it costs you more than it protects anyone. I've worked with so many people, and I've been this person, where the ethical impulse turned inward and became a kind of self-surveillance, watching every move, bracing for the impact you might have caused, apologizing before anyone's even told you something went wrong. Ethical maturity isn't about becoming smaller. It's about learning to hold responsibility without collapsing under it, staying present with impact rather than fleeing from it, using power with awareness instead of shame. The goal was never to eliminate your influence. It's to develop the capacity to carry it without it caving in on you. And when that same pattern flips outward, when ethics get used on someone else instead of turned inward, what happens there is worth naming just as plainly.
External misuse of ethics, projection and control.
When ethics get misused externally, the same dynamic flips outward. It stops being a guide and becomes a weapon. This shows up as ethical language to shame someone, labeling others as unethical as a form of social punishment, invoking ethics to override another person's autonomy, as if having ethical authority gives you the right to control what someone else does. In those moments, ethics isn't being used to hold responsibility. It's being used to manage discomfort, assert dominance, or deflect from something unexamined internally. And when ethics turns into coercion, the results are predictable. Trust erodes. Safety decreases. People stop engaging authentically and start managing, complying to stay safe, performing to avoid punishment, or disengaging altogether. The power dynamics that ethics was supposed to regulate don't soften. They distort further. I experienced this directly in the corporate world. I had a manager who used ethical language, what was right, what was professional, what was appropriate, as a way to pressure me into compliance. It wasn't a conversation about responsibility. It was shame dressed up as standards. And what I noticed in my body was the shutdown that happened, not reflection, not genuine reconsideration, just the instinct to go quiet, to manage, to survive the interaction. That's what coercion ethics produces, not growth, not accountability, just people learning to perform safety. I want to say this plainly. Ethics used to control is not ethics. It's power misuse wearing ethical language. Real ethics doesn't override autonomy, doesn't rely on fear, and doesn't need shame to function. It creates more capacity for genuine choice, for real responsibility, for repair, never less. So we've looked at how ethics get misused, inward and outward. Now I want to turn it practical. Because ethics isn't just something you think about after the fact. It shows up in your body in real time before you've had a chance to analyze anything.
Ethics in real time. Reading your own reactions.
One of the most practical things we can do with what we've covered is learn to read our own reactions as they're happening. Because ethics isn't just a framework we apply after the fact. It shows up in the moment, in our bodies, before we've had a chance to think. When outrage flares towards someone else, something specific is happening. We're witnessing behavior that violates one of our moral guardrails, and the heat comes from the ethical layer underneath. We're seeing someone act in a way we would not allow ourselves to act. Our internal regulator is signaling that breaks the behavioral code. That's not dysfunction. That's our ethical system working. And when we feel disappointed in ourselves or guilty or quietly ashamed, it's almost always because we violated our own operational ethic, not our abstract moral, necessarily the behavioral standard. We value accountability. Our ethic says when we're aware, we act. If we delay action after awareness, we feel friction. That friction isn't proof we're a bad person. It's our integrity system signaling misalignment. But here's where it gets more nuanced and more honest. Not all outrage is clean. Sometimes the outrage is clean. Someone truly violated consent, integrity, or the responsible use of power, and our system is responding accurately. But sometimes the outrage is displaced. The other person is doing something we give ourselves permission to do, or something we've done and never fully reconciled. And sometimes the outrage is projected. We're punishing externally what we haven't dealt with internally. So the adult move isn't to ask, am I right to be outraged? It's to ask, what ethic of mine is being triggered right now? If we can name the specific ethic, consent, integrity, power, responsibility, we regain agency. We're no longer being run by the reaction, we're decoding it. And breaking our own ethic doesn't mean we're a bad person. It makes us human. What matters is what happens next. Do we rationalize or do we recalibrate? Integrity isn't never failing our own standard. It's noticing the gap and correcting course. That's what ethical maturity actually looks like in motion. There's also a difference worth naming in the weight of these reactions. Some ethical responses are relatively quiet. Someone acts in a way we simply wouldn't, and we note it without much heat. Not my style, not how I operate. We observe and move on. No surge, just difference. But other ethical responses are layered and intense because they're connected to a core moral. When those ethics are violated, the response isn't just a disagree with that behavior. It feels like a threat to something structural. Moral, ethic, and identity are all pointing at the same thing, and disrupting one feels like disrupting all three. So before we act on the heat, it's worth asking one more question. Is this moral integrated heat, meaning something genuinely violated consent, integrity, or responsible use of power? Or is this ego integrated heat, meaning something made us feel less capable, less powerful, or misunderstood? Both feel urgent. They require very different responses. Moral integrated heat calls for grounded action. Ego integrated heat calls for a pause and an honest check. This is ethics working as a real-time regulatory tool, not a philosophy we apply after the fact, but a signal system we can read in the moment. That's where the framework stops being theoretical and starts becoming something we can actually use. And once you can read those real-time signals accurately, the next question is, what do you do when you've already caused impact? That's where repair comes in, and it's a capacity most people skip over.
Ethical repair is a distinct capacity.
There's something that gets missed most often in these conversations, and I don't want to skip over it. Ethics isn't only about preventing harm. It's also, maybe especially, about what happens after impact is recognized. And that's where ethical repair comes in. Repair is not an apology reflex. It's not self-punishment. And it's not managing how you look after something goes sideways. It's a specific capacity, the ability to stay present with impact once it's been revealed, without getting defensive, without collapsing, without trying to control the outcome. It asks different questions than prevention does. Can I acknowledge what happened without erasing myself in the process? Can I listen without rushing toward forgiveness? Can I change behavior, not just explain it? Repair doesn't mean your intentions didn't matter. It means your intentions didn't cancel your impact. Both things can be true. I want to be honest about this from my own life. When my children were young, I didn't have the capacity to live by my ethics, my values, or my morals. Not really. I was in survival mode. My nervous system was running the show, and the decisions I made from that place caused real harm to my kids. Not because I didn't love them, but because love alone isn't ethics, and capacity matters. You can only operate from where you actually are. I can't rewrite those years. That's not available to me. What is available is how I show up now, as a mature adult with more self-awareness, more regulation, more honest accountability for what happened. And I do that as much as they allow me to. I show up in their healing not by demanding forgiveness or rushing toward a resolution, but by being different consistently over time. That's what repair actually looks like. That's what repair actually looks like when it's real. Not a conversation, not an apology, a sustained change in how you use the power you have, this time more carefully. And ethical maturity isn't measured by never causing harm. That's not a human standard. It shows up in how quickly impact is acknowledged, how cleanly responsibility is held, and how consistently behavior actually changes afterward. Avoiding repair tends to look like defending intent, minimizing impact, or rushing toward resolution before the person is ready. Ethical repair doesn't rush. It prioritizes clarity. It prioritizes clarity over comfort and relationship over self-protection. Repair isn't weakness. It's power being reheld more carefully this time. Repair done well creates something, and part of what it creates is a felt sense of what ethics actually feels like when it's working, which is very different from the pressure and self-monitoring most people associate it with.
What ethics feel like when used correctly?
I want to say something about what ethics actually feels like when it's working, because it's not what most people expect. I've come to know the difference in my own body. When ethics is functioning the way it's meant to, there's a quality of clarity rather than urgency. Accountability that doesn't collapse into shame. Responsibility that doesn't require self-erasure. There's transparency around power and a kind of safety around truth. You're present, not performing. There's less bracing, less of that low-level anxiety about getting it wrong, and underneath all of it, more steadiness. Ethics doesn't ask you to disappear, diminish, or become perfect. It allows you to stay whole while staying responsible. That distinction is worth sitting with, because a lot of people have been taught that being ethical means making yourself smaller. It doesn't. Ethics isn't something you are. It's not an identity or a label you earn. It's a capacity to notice power, stay present with impact, respond rather than defend, and repair without collapsing your sense of self in the process. And like any capacity, it can be built slowly, relationally, and without shame. The felt sense is real, and it becomes even more concrete when you look at the specific places ethics show up in ordinary life, not in dramatic situations, but in everyday ones.
What ethics looks like in real life.
Ethics isn't abstract. It becomes visible in very ordinary domains of life, especially anywhere influence and vulnerability intersect. I see it in leadership and authority, in how decisions get made and communicated, in information asymmetry, what you know that someone else doesn't, and how you handle that gap. In coaching, therapy, teaching, or any kind of spiritual influence where trust and guidance carry real weight. In the difference between consent and pressure. In what gets named openly versus what gets quietly softened or avoided. In institutions where policies affect people unevenly. And in how impact gets addressed or doesn't after something goes wrong. Those are the environments where ethics stop being theoretical. It becomes something you either doing or not doing in real time with real people. And here's what I want to say plainly, because I think it matters. You don't need a perfect personality to be ethical. You don't need flawless intentions or moral certainty. What ethics actually requires is simpler than that, and honestly harder. just a willingness to notice where you have influence, to stay present with the impact of your choices, to hold responsibility where power exists even when it's inconvenient. That's willingness, quiet, steady, underperformed, is what ethical practice actually looks like. And because ethics live in real life, in real relationships, real power, real impact, it's worth asking who actually holds it accountable. Because it isn't a neutral system with a referee. It's much more human than that.
Who judges ethics and who does not?
There's no cosmic referee when it comes to ethics. No external force keeping score. No universal system stepping in to reward or punish. Ethics lives much closer to home than that. In practice, ethics get held and evaluated in a few very human ways. First, by the person with power, through internal responsibility. Ethics begins when someone is willing to notice their influence and stay present with it, rather than deflect or minimize it. Second, by the person who was affected, not because they're always objectively right, but because impact is what activates ethics in the first place. Ethics doesn't exist without someone being affected. And third, by time. Unaddressed impact accumulates. Ethical debt doesn't disappear. It tends to show up later in the form of eroded trust, growing distance, and eventual rupture. It's worth naming what doesn't determine ethics: authority, consensus, intention, comfort, success, or winning. Something doesn't become ethical because it worked, because it was justified, or because the person in power felt certain. Winning an argument doesn't make the position ethical. Believing strongly in your cause doesn't make the method ethical. Feeling right is not the same as being responsible. Ethics isn't about who prevailed. It's about whether responsibility was held where power existed. And answering that honestly requires something quieter than force or approval. Attention to impact, willingness to repair, and the capacity to stay accountable without collapsing. That's where ethics actually live. There's one more thing I want to say before we close, and it's the place I consider the hardest to sit with. The one I had to earn through experience, not just understand intellectually.
Ethics as stabilizer when the system doesn't care.
I want to share something that I think is one of the most important things I've learned, and it's not a comfortable thing to say. My third moral is a commitment to building a life that gives my children more than what I started with. More resources, more stability, more freedom, and the ethics that flow directly from that moral feel straightforward. Tell the truth, don't deceive, don't manipulate, show your children what integrity looks like. Simple enough in theory. Here's what happened in practice. There was a period in my life, a legal situation, a system I was moving through, where I had to make choices, repeatedly about how I was going to show up. And what I discovered was this: telling the truth got used against me. Not telling the truth also got used against me. Harm came to me and to my children, regardless of which choice I made. The system did not care about my ethics. It was structured to weaponize whatever information I gave it. And I had to sit with that fully, because it dismantled something I've been quietly holding, a belief, maybe a child-coded belief, that if I was good, if I acted with integrity, the outcome would reflect that the system would respond to honesty with fairness. It didn't. And this is one of the hardest truths adults eventually face. Ethical behavior does not guarantee protection from harm. You can tell the truth and lose. You can refuse to deceive and still be punished. You can act with integrity and still suffer real consequences. And so can the people you love. So what do you do with that? Because if ethics don't protect you, why hold them? Here's what I came to understand, and it changed everything for me. Ethics are not a shield, they are a stabilizer. A shield is meant to prevent the storm from hitting you. A stabilizer keeps you from becoming the storm. Those are completely different functions. And when I stopped expecting ethics to shield me, to protect me from hostile systems, to guarantee fair outcomes, to make other people behave well toward me, and started understanding them as stabilizers, something shifted internally. Because here's what stayed true even in the middle of all of that. I knew who I was. I knew how I had chosen to show up. Whatever the system did with that, whatever outcome landed, I hadn't betrayed myself to avoid suffering. And that distinction, as small as it might sound in the middle of real harm, is the thing that held me together. Now let me talk about the modeling piece, because this is where legacy ethics actually lives. Modeling ethics for your children does not mean showing them that integrity always wins. That would be a lie. And modeling a lie, even a comforting one, is its own ethical problem. What modeling ethics actually looks like is showing your children that you act in alignment with your code even when the outcome is uncertain. That you don't abandon your standards because the system is hostile. That you don't collapse into deception because deception might have been easier in the short term. When my children witnessed what happened, the harm, the financial consequences, the separation, they also saw something else. They saw that truth may cost you, but you don't fall apart. You don't become the thing that hurts you. You keep moving in alignment. That's backbone. And backbone is inherited differently than financial stability. It goes deeper and it lasts longer. So if you're living ethically inside a system that is not rewarding it, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not wrong. You are not naive. You are not losing because your ethics are flawed. Sometimes ethical action increases short-term harm, especially in systems structured to punish transparency. Whistleblowers lose jobs. Truth tellers get smeared. People who refuse to manipulate lose leverage. This is real. That is real, and it deserves to be named as real. But what I've also seen in my own life and in others is that abandoning your ethics to win those battles corrodes something internal that doesn't come back easily. The cost of abandoning ethics is paid inside. The benefit of holding them is also inside. Coherence, identity, the ability to look at yourself clearly in the aftermath. Living ethically does not mean you won't suffer. It means you won't betray yourself to avoid suffering. That's the adult versions of ethics. That's what I needed to understand years ago. And it's what I most want to give you now. We went deep today, and I want to honor that. So I want to close by saying this.
Closing from Map into Movement.
Ethics is chosen responsibility, not imposed virtue. It doesn't come from gods, governments, or crowds. It doesn't arrive through fear or approval. It comes from people deciding to hold responsibility, even when convenience would be easier, even when no one is watching, and even when it would be simpler to look away. That's a quiet kind of power, and it's available to anyone willing to do the internal work that makes it possible. So this is where we land today, and also where a new question starts to open up. Because once you understand your morals, your values, and your ethics, the ecosystem has structure. You have the internal map, and the next natural question is, how do you actually use it? How do values and ethics move out of insight and into daily life, into something you can rely on under real pressure? How do you build standards that guide you without making you rigid? How do you set boundaries that are clean and clear rather than reactive or flimsy? That's where we're going next, from understanding into application, from map into movement. I'm going to pause here and let this land. If something in this resonated, you don't need to do anything with it. Just sit with it and notice what continues to unfold. Thank you for listening and for being here with me.